Most Palestinians have never left Gaza because they're not allowed to. So when Israel recently said it would grant a few hundred work permits, this is what happened. It's not quite a matter of life or death, but it's not far from it. Gaza, 5 months after the war ended, is still a land of rubble and fear. The ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, the militant organization which controls Gaza, is fragile, but it is just about holding for now. But in their first interview since mediation talks in Egypt ended, Hamas has told Sky News that they will continue to fight Israel.
We can defeat Israel. We can target Israel. I think we target Israel many times. Okay, we can kill. They can come and destroy everything. But in the same time, Israel will never see the stability unless the Palestinians get their stability and their security. They have to understand this.
So you'll continue to fight Israel?
Yes,
you'll continue
yes.
to strike Israel?
Yes. It is our right, national right.
If that happens, there will be more scenes like this. 6-year-old Susie was rescued holding the body of her younger brother. Her apartment block was hit by an Israeli missile during the recent conflict. Her 2 sisters, her 2 brothers, and her mother died in the airstrike. This patch of sand is what is left of their home today. Israel said that it was targeting Hamas tunnels nearby and that their deaths were unintended. Susie is traumatized. She plays alone, she barely speaks, and she wakes screaming in the night. Her father dreads another war.
وفي الحرب طلعت بس في امها اللي بتديها الامان اكثر وحاجه هيك. قلت لا الموضوع هذا مش موجود عندها، قلت يعني لو صارت حرب يعني الله اعلم يعني ايش يصير فيها. يعني احنا بدنا حاجه جذريه تحمي المدنيين والاطفال من اي حرب جايه. يعني ما فيش فايده اني احكي لاسرائيل واحكي لحماس، يعني الرسائل بتتسجل على ورق. ان شاء الله هذه بتكبر وتصير يعني زي ما بدها ومتعلمه وتسند حالها وتدير بالها حالها، لانه يعني حيكون عليها حمل كبير.
Susie and her father are the victims of the actions of both sides in this ongoing conflict. Right now, the chances of a lasting truce seem pretty small. On the one hand, both sides say that they want peace and that it is not in their interests to start another conflict. But on the other hand, neither side can agree on a way that they can live together on the same piece of land. And as long as that difference remains, another war seems inevitable.
Violent Israeli raids in occupied East Jerusalem wound dozens. Palestinians condemned the Israeli bill giving broad powers to police. And Israel approves thousands of illegal settlements, homes in East Jerusalem. This is the latest news. Al Jazeera headliner, violent Israeli raids in occupied East Jerusalem wound dozens, dated October 19, 2021. Israeli forces violently raided Damascus Gate and surrounding streets in occupied East Jerusalem for the second day in a row during a Palestinian national holiday for the Prophet Muhammad's birthday. At least 22 Palestinians were wounded on Tuesday, 25 arrested, according to local media. The majority of those arrested were minors. Widely circulated images and videos show Israeli forces violently arresting and assaulting young people on Monday, both male and female, beating passerby with batons, chasing after children and families, raiding the main commercial street, and indiscriminately firing tear gas and sound bombs at crowds. They also attacked medical staff. On both Monday and Tuesday, activities for families and children were taking place at Damascus Gate, one of the few public spaces where Palestinians in the city gather to celebrate the Prophet's birthday. Matters visibly escalated in the area on Monday evening when Israeli occupation forces wounded at least 49 Palestinians and arrested 10, according to local media. Local media said Monday medical workers dealt with 5 rubber bullet coated metal bullet wounds, 19 sound bomb shrapnel injuries, as well as dozens from physical assault. At least 2 local journalists were violently arrested while covering the events. There have been arrests every night and day at the Damascus Gate and the surrounding areas as Palestinian anger mounted over the desecration of graves in a historic Muslim cemetery near the Old City, parts of which are being built over to make an national park. The Israeli-controlled Jerusalem municipality began the latest rounds of excavations in the cemetery on October 10th. The situation has escalated in recent days, however, with Israeli forces violently raiding and clearing Palestinians out of the few public spaces available to them in occupied East Jerusalem, including Damascus Gate and Saha al-Din Street. Damascus Gate, near the old city of Jerusalem, is a place where young Palestinians like to gather in the evening and socialize with their friends. But for the last months, Israeli police and special forces have been violently forcing them to disperse to make way for Israeli settlers entering the old city, Jawad Siam of the Wadi Heleb Center in East Jerusalem. Siam said the center recorded in the last 2 weeks the arrest of more than 82 minors, a significant portion of them under the age of 13. Police dogs and a skunk water machine, which sprays hard to remove foul water, has also been deployed in the forced removals. Palestinians come to Damascus Gate to do more than socialize. They gathered also to debate policy of defiance against the Israeli occupation and its discriminatory laws and practices that favors Jewish settlers over Palestinians. 2 Israeli policemen are being investigated by the Israeli Police Investigations Department for using unnecessary force against Palestinians. Last week, Hussein al-Zir from the Jerusalem neighborhood of Silwan was sitting with his friends near Damascus Gate, enjoying an evening out. He told Al Jazeera that about a half a dozen Israeli border police armed with batons, sound bombs, and tear gas canisters rushed them and ordered them to disperse. Those who refused to move on or film the attack were beaten. Some were arrested. According to a UN Development Program report released in 2016, in conjunction with the Palestinian Authority, Israeli authorities in Jerusalem allocate only 10% of their budget to occupied East Jerusalem, with the remainder going to West Jerusalem. Under international law, Israeli settlements and the transfer of settlers to occupied territories are illegal. And the unofficial annexation of East Jerusalem was declared null and void by UN Security Council Resolution 478. Headliner, Al Jazeera. Palestinians condemn Israeli bill giving broad powers to police, dated October 19, 2021. Israel is taking steps toward over-policing and increasing its surveillance of the Palestinian population inside its 1949 borders under the pretext of curbing the high crime rate within the community, Palestinians say. In the latest measure, the Israeli cabinet approved a proposal on Sunday granting police with what Palestinians view as overly broad powers, allowing them to freely search homes without a court warrant. They think they can find a suspect or evidence related to a serious crime, according to Israeli media. The bill proposed by Minister Gideon Sa'ar comes after a government decision last month to deploy the internal Israeli intelligence services known as Shabak or Shin Bet in Palestinian towns and villages as part of its national fight against crime. With the cabinet's support, the bill would be voted on the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, before becoming law. It is not clear whether the proposal will get the majority vote. Hassan Jabrin, founder and director of Abdallah, the main Palestinian legal defense organization inside Israel, said the bill will give police the pretext to search any Palestinian home. Hassan went on to say, in practice, they will be able to go into the majority of Arab homes because in every Arab neighborhood and town there are shootings and killings. It's enough for them to be suspicious to do so. He said it means that there would be no judicial supervision over the operation of entering into homes, which strips homes of their sanctity. This will allow the police to even enter homes and use them for maneuvering. For example, if they are suspicious of the house next door. Hassan went on to say, we are going from under-policing to over-policing, one extreme to another, adding that the new legislation could be used to terrorize people, particularly during times of protest. Awad Abdel Fattah, a political writer and former general secretary of the National Democratic Alliance Party, said it creates a state of tension for Palestinians. He told Al Jazeera, it will restrict our freedoms and put us under more surveillance. From the town of Kaukab near Haifa. Last week, Israeli officials also advanced a plan to permit administration detention against the community, a police used by the Israeli occupation army in the West Bank, which allows them to detain Palestinians indefinitely without trial or charges. During the past decade, the issue of crime and homicides has plagued the Palestinian community inside Israel, referred to as the 1948 occupied territories, or the occupied interior by Palestinians. The number of killings has risen dramatically over the past few years. So far in 2021, more than 100 Palestinians have been killed in homicides, surpassing last year's total of 97. In 2013, there were 53 killings. While Israel opened a large number of police stations in and around Palestinian towns during and following the Second Intifada in 2000, shootings have mushroomed during the last decade, the vast majority of cases going unsolved. Historic mass protests and confrontations with police broke out March 2021 in the focal town of al-Fan against police indifference and against what Palestinians say Israelis' investment in the endurance of crime within the community to weaken it, and collusion with criminal gangs. Abdel Fattah said Israel is using internal violence as a cheap method to exert control over Palestinians. He also went on to say internal violence in the 48 occupied areas is the result of colonial violence and colonial policies that created all the social, cultural, and economic conditions to block the path, the horizon, and hope for Palestinians until they turn against themselves. Rights groups have documented the struggle for Palestinians in Israel, who number 1.8 million. In addition to Israel's efforts to suppress their Palestinian identity over the years, the majority live in densely populated towns and with little access to land and resources, most of which were seized during and after 1948 for Jewish settlers. On August 11th, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett announced the establishment of a ministerial committee fighting crime and violence in the Arab sector as part of a national plan to wage an unceasing, constant, and persistent fight with full force against crime and violence. Under the plan, steps laid out include increasing police presence in Palestinian towns, as well as strengthening intelligence and investigation capabilities, expanding the legal toolkit, using advanced technological means in support of enforcement and prevention efforts, and advancing legislation on the issue. 2 new police stations will be opened among Palestinian towns in the northern Marj Ibn Amir area and in the coastal Palestinian town of Jazir al-Zarqa, as well as among Palestinian Bedouin communities in the Nakab Desert. Following the recent decision to involve the Shin Bet in the crime problem, Abdallah submitted a petition called it illegal, in a direct continuation of military rule in reference to the period between 1948 and 1966, under which Palestinians in Israel lived under harsh military control. Abdallah argued that it creates 2 separate law enforcement systems, one for Palestinian Arab towns, neighborhoods, and citizens, and the other for the rest of the country. It also introduced the Shin Bet into a civilian space where they have no legal authority. Abdel Fattah described the Shin Bet as one of the most powerful and dangerous devices of repression since 1948, and it pervades the Palestinian community inside Israel. He said he has surveilled himself. He was arrested from his home and taken for questioning on multiple occasions on the basis of inciting against the state, but never formally charged. He was also terminated from 3 workplaces. He went on to say, they are increasing surveillance and pressure on us while weakening us so politically to get us to leave the country voluntarily. In the last popular outburst in May, the 1948 occupied areas played a major role. there is a young, angry generation that is growing in awareness that will not stay silent. Memo, Middle East Monitor, headliner. Israel approves thousands of illegal settlement homes in East Jerusalem, dated October 14, 2021. An Israeli planning government committee yesterday approved plans advancing the construction of thousands of homes in Givat Hamatos, an illegal East Jerusalem settlement that threatens to cut off parts of the city from its Palestinian residents in the West Bank. According to Peace Now activist Hagid Ofran, the Palestinian area of Kibbutz Tabalia, southwest of the city, had already been allocated for use in Givat Hamatos. She described yesterday's approval as a bureaucratic move. The expropriation is necessary to advance the plan, but the plan as a whole is hurting forward. It seems to be very much a done deal, Ofran said. The illegal settlement currently consists of a set of caravans and mobile homes set up in the early 1990s for Ethiopian settlers. And according to the Jerusalem Post, Israeli Planning and Building Committee member Yehuda Freduger said, I was happy today to be a partner in advancing the construction plan of Givat Hamatos. Jerusalem craves land for construction. Givat Hamatos is an ideal place that does not harm nature and is close to existing neighborhoods. All lovers of Jerusalem and lovers in the environment and protecting nature should do everything possible to promote the plan and not let political pressures delay it. The announcement of the expropriation comes in just a day after Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid met with U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris in Washington. Despite repeated warnings from Israel's allies against the building of settlements in the West Bank, all of which are illegal under international law, the Bennett government has continued to push ahead with construction. The European Union pointed out earlier this year that the implementation of these plans, especially the construction of additional housing units in the settlement of Givat Hamatos near the settlement of Har Homa, would sever the link between East Jerusalem and Bethlehem and undermine the negotiations for a two-state solution. The European statement also reminded Israel that all settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories are illegal according to international law. The European Union reiterates its call to the Israeli government to stop building settlements and to urgently reverse its recent decisions. This comes at the heels of a U.S. progressive bill promoting, as the House and Senate promoting a two-state solution in which progressives slammed the bill. A month earlier, in September, U.S. Congressman Andy Levine had introduced legislation that would cement the two-state solution to the Palestinian conflict. But pro-Palestinian and progressive advocates say that the legislation bill falls short of offering any reasonable measures to ensure Palestinian rights and fails to hold Israeli accountable for its past grievances and human rights abuses and its violations of international law regarding the settlements that are being built in places like Givat Hamos and other areas like Har Homa. However, with that being said, according to the bill, it would also require the products made in the Palestinian territories be labeled as either made in the West Bank or made in Gaza, which reversed an order by the former Trump administration that requires goods made in Israeli-controlled areas of the West Bank to be labeled made in Israel. Previously, Biden had said that the two-state solution is the only way to solve the issue. However, during his speech at the United Nations General Assembly last month, he noted that we are a long way from that goal at this moment. And of course they are. They've been talking about this for the last, 30, 40 years now, with no type of progressive action being taken. And that's because the Israeli right-wing government and its nationalist policies, which, they claim doesn't exist anymore, or that were not led by the Likud party. Well, I could tell you right now that the Israeli government is still not going to propose any type of two-state solution, no matter who is the president. This is the problem. As long as you have a executive branch where the prime minister is the most powerful political figure in the country and not the president, people like Naftali Bennett, who has basically openly admitted that he has killed Palestinians, male and female, and even children. And when you still have elements of the Likud party still in the Knesset, as well as people within the government itself that caters basically to the political parties like the Kadima, the Israeli Betanu, and Labor, and the Shahs. There's going to be no real, true Arab representation. Now, according to a 2020 Amnesty International report, when it comes to forcible transfers and forced eviction and demolitions, the report found this, quote, Israel demolished 848 Palestinian residential and livelihood structures in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, displacing 996 people, according to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Israeli authorities said many of the demolished homes lacked Israel-issued permits, which are virtually impossible for Palestinians to obtain, or were enclosed military zones. The law of occupation prohibits such destruction unless necessary for military operations. In other cases, Israel confiscated residential and livelihood structures, including some that were donated for humanitarian purposes. Israeli forces also punitively demolished at least 6 Palestinian homes, leaving 22 people, including 7 children, homeless, according to B'Tselem. Punitive demolitions constitute collective punishment and are prohibited under international law. Israeli settler organizations initiated, with the support of the Israeli authorities, forcible evictions of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem. The UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or the OCHA, estimated in December that around 200 Palestinian households in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, had eviction cases pending against them, placing 800 adults and children at risk of displacement. Israeli authorities demolished at least 29 residential and livelihood structures that belonged to Bedouin citizens living as unrecognized villages in the Negev Nakab, according to the Negev Coexistence Forum, an Israeli NGO, end quote. And when it comes to unlawful killings and excessive use of force, the report goes on to say, quote, Israeli military and police use unnecessary and excessive force during law enforcement activities, including search and arrest operations, and when policing demonstrations. Military and security forces killed at least 31 Palestinians, including 9 children, in the Gaza Strip and West Bank, according to the OCHA. Many were unlawfully killed by live ammunition or other excessive force when posing no imminent threat to life. Some of the unlawful killings appeared to be willful, which would constitute war crimes. On February 15th of 2020, Israel forces shot and injured in the eye 9-year-old Malek Issa while he was returning home from school in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Isiwa. No clashes were recorded at the time, according to the OCHA, and Israeli forces were maintaining a violent and intense police operation in Isiwa as a form of collective punishment. Israeli forces frequently opened fire on fishermen and farmers in Gaza, according to the Al Mizan Center for Human Rights. 12 fishermen and 5 farmers were injured. And the report goes to talk about torture and other ill treatment, freedoms of expression, association, and the abuses of gender-based violence, the rights of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. This seems to be a consistent problem that is reported year after year by human rights groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. And so with the number of people, and especially with the bill that's labeled progressive just last month, which of course is not a progressive bill, because as Sana Siddiqui, the policy manager at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, who criticized the bill, saying it would basically simply return Washington to the pre-Trump status quo in Israel and Palestine. And to quote her, she basically says it instead focuses on the continued annual transfer of 3.8 billion in military funding to Israel. The bill, while opposing settlement expansion in theory, fails to have oversight or enforcement mechanisms to hold Israel accountable, end quote. And that was last month. I mean, everybody remembers the overwhelming majority of the Democrats and Republicans who voted in favor of this bill. Meanwhile, in contrast to the American public, especially to the lower middle class who are suffering under the COVID-19 restrictions and the lack of employment, the stimulus packages of the last 16 months, the pittance that we've been getting, which was basically an argument in limbo between the House and the Senate. But here you have a government, a U.S. government, that is heavily influenced by a foreign power, which is Israel, headed under the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, which caters to both the Democratic and Republican Party, as well as even independent. So that'll be for the latest news.